Imagine you live in Rome in the year 663 AD. It would be a very special year for that city, which had endured so many hardships in the last 2 centuries. Since 410, the city had been sacked or besieged countless times, 3 times in the 5th century and another 3 times in the 6th century. The population of once mighty Rome had declined from a staggering 800,000 in the year 400 AD to a meager 30,000 by the year 600. And yet still, in 663 AD, something was about to happen that had not happened in 2 centuries. A Roman emperor would arrive in Rome with his entire retinue, a Roman emperor from Constantinople. Indeed, Constans II was the reigning emperor of the Roman Empire in those times, and he was about to visit Rome. How would that have been? How did that visit look? And how would it have been to witness this visit as someone living there? By 600 AD, Rome was but a shadow of its former self. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, the many sacks and sieges of the city, the many plagues and disasters had taken a brutal toll on once mighty Rome. 6 sacks or sieges in 2 centuries, the famine of 536 following the climatic event of that year, and the plague of Justinian in 541, which recurred time and time again, seeing multiple outbreaks. These events had taken a toll on Rome. Most aqueducts were in disrepair since they had been cut in the siege of the Ostrogoths in 537 AD. This is also when most of the baths had stopped working and then were used as storage spaces or converted into churches, and others just fell gradually into ruin. However, some few baths continued working and were maintained, since 1 or 2 out of the 11 big aqueducts had been repaired. The population, which went as low as 30,000 around 600 AD, would slowly start to recover again to around 50,000 by 663 AD. In that year, something would happen that had not happened in almost 200 years. It was as if the old glory days had returned. A Roman emperor would visit Rome. The first Roman emperor to reside in the city since Julius Nepos in 475. It must have been quite a spectacle for the 50,000 people that still lived in the old venerable city. The Emperor Constans II, after having campaigned against the Lombards without great success, arrived at some point in 663 AD outside the city walls with his imperial retinue and was ceremoniously received by the Pope, the clergy and notables. Senators weren't present anymore in those days because the last members of the Senate of Rome had disappeared between 608 and around 620 AD. I talked about the last senators of Rome and what possibly happened to them in this video here. Constans II would stay in Rome for 12 days. In that time, he toured many of the ancient monuments of the city, most of which were still in surprisingly good condition even in those times. Sure, the roads in the city weren't in great shape, often filled with dirt and rubble from collapsed buildings. For instance, it was found that a collapsed column of the temple of Apollo Susianus, probably damaged in the earthquake of 508, was just left lying on the street, and a bridge was built over it. A very pragmatic solution, but it shows that Rome must have offered a bit of a chaotic sight in those times. Yet, even though the outer-lying streets must have been in bad shape and filled with dirt and rubble, the great fora were all kept free. The Forum Romanum, for instance, was still even in 663 at the same ground level that it had been 3 centuries earlier. And so, as the Emperor Constans II would have been met outside at St. Peter's Basilica, he would then have entered the city through one of the gates of the Aurelian Wall, and then would have been shown through the city, seeing many of the old spectacular buildings and sites from the era of the old emperors. The mausoleum of Hadrian was still standing and in good condition. The mausoleum of Augustus as well. Even the Colosseum was still in pretty good shape. It was found that a member of Constance's retinue had scratched the emperor's name into the stairwell inside the column of Trajan and onto the Janus Quadrifont's, hence memorizing this event for all eternity. The emperor probably also saw the Temple of Venus and Roma, which was still standing, and even though the gilded roof tiles had been removed in 630 in order to adorn St. Peter's Basilica, even so, the temple structure was still intact and still very imposing. Unfortunately, we don't really know what the emperor was thinking when he saw these sites, but it is very likely that he was impressed by the ancient grandeur of the city. After all, it was in Rome where the Roman Empire had started long before his time, and the Eastern Romans of Constantinople knew this fact, and hence Rome still held a high significance for them. He probably toured the city, saw the still essentially intact baths of Diocletian and of Caracalla, which were, even though without water, still standing imposingly in those times. He might have even enjoyed a bath in one of the few still working thermae of the old times. And if you are like me, very much interested in the era of the kingdom of Theodoric in Italy, shortly before or during the Gothic Wars, then I have some very interesting news for you. Marco Cappelli, the creator of the Storia d'Italia podcast, on which I recently had the honor to speak, is working on a fascinating comic, which you can help to finance on Kickstarter. It is called Ammianus Vesper Mundi, and it takes place in the era of the Ostrogoths in Italy in the early 6th century. So it is a very fascinating time that I am also very much interested in as well. Please consider supporting this amazing Kickstarter project so that we can get ourselves a copy of that fascinating comic, because I think that this graphic novel will show us how life probably was in the era of the Gothic kingdom in Italy. And now back to Constans II in Rome. While in Rome, the Emperor Constans II was actually still living in the old palace of the Caesars on the Palatine Hill. That same palace complex in which Augustus or Domitian had lived 6 to 7 centuries before him. We know that there was a curator of the palace still in charge until at least 687, and parts of the huge palace complex were thus still repaired and maintained until at least the early 8th century. The emperor probably also saw the markets of Trajan, since he was, as we said, at the column of Trajan. The markets of Trajan still stood until the 9th century. They were probably destroyed though in the strong earthquake of 847 AD, which also destroyed many others of the ancient structures, such as the amazing Basilica of Maxentius. On the Tiber River, the emperor would have seen the river mills, which were constructed by none other than Flavius Belisarius himself, the legendary Eastern Roman commander who had defeated many enemies of the empire. Belisarius constructed those river mills during the Gothic siege of 537, and these river mills would continue to play a pivotal role in feeding the population of Rome even until the 19th century, crazy enough. If you would have lived in Rome in those 12 days of the year 663, you would have seen a procession of the imperial retinue marching through Rome from side to side for 12 days, to the remains of the Circus Maximus, which was still standing, even though admittedly in not the best shape, to the Septizodium of Septimius Severus, to the famous Colossus, which was probably also still standing in those times, to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, which in those days was probably still in pretty good shape, even though of course it was missing the roof and was bereft of all the statues on the inside. It must have been quite the spectacle to behold, seeing the emperor and his retinue marching through the entire city. The emperor was probably pulled on some sort of cart, surrounded by his personal bodyguards, followed by high-ranking officials of the city. In the area of the Forum Romanum, you would still have seen most of the old temples and buildings intact. As we said, the area was kept free of dirt and rubble, and was actually still a hub of activity even in those days. The last known erected monument in the Forum was the column of Phocas, erected in 608, which actually was an old column from the era of the Tetrarchs, onto which a statue of the Emperor Phocas was placed. In the Forum itself, there were still vendors. It was still used as a marketplace, in which wares were sold, and even slaves still from time to time. But of course, luckily, not as frequently anymore as in the old times. And of course, the population density was a lot lower in 663 than in previous centuries. There were much less people on the streets, and at times, peasants would pull cattle through the fora to the outer lying fields in the now abandoned areas of this gigantic old city. But in 663 AD, Rome was still very much in Roman hands. The city had been under control of the Eastern Romans since around 550 AD, and it would stay so for almost another century after the visit of Constans II. Rome was again part of the Roman Empire for 200 years, from around 550 to 751, a fact that many historians seem to forget, often calling that period Byzantine occupation. But the people living in those times didn't see it that way. They thought that they were part of the same Roman Empire from hundreds of years earlier. For didn't also the Emperor Theodosius reside at Constantinople? Or didn't also the Emperor Constantius II reside at Constantinople when he visited Rome in 357 AD? Was that then also a Byzantine occupation? And when did the Romanness end and the Byzantineness start? It is very hard to say, and in fact, it was a gradual change. In many parts, in 663 AD, there were still impressive remnants of antiquity visible. And so who are we to say that this Rome of 663 AD was under Byzantine occupation? It was part of the Roman Empire, which still had the capital in Constantinople, the same as it had been 3 centuries earlier. Anyways, of course it would be quite visible that Rome in those times was under Eastern Roman influence. Since Constantinople in those times was a much larger city than Rome, it is quite obvious that the cultural influence of the East must have been visible at Rome. Many churches were constructed in the Eastern Roman or Byzantine art style after 550 AD throughout the city. There was even a Byzantine quarter near the Forum Romanum, where the Eastern Roman government officials resided, some sort of administrative quarter. In the times of Constans II, they often corresponded with the exarch at Ravenna, the viceroy of the emperor, so to speak. In the Forum, there was also the Curia Julia, which was vacant since the disappearance of the Roman Senate some 40 years prior. It was transformed into the Basilica of Sant Adriano al Foro in 630. In fact, many of the old structures were saved by having been converted into churches. This also happened with the Pantheon, which had been converted into a church as well in 608. In fact, it was Phocas again who had donated the Pantheon to Pope Boniface in that same year. It was him who strengthened the papacy in Rome a lot, And this was likely also a reason why the Senate of Rome lost more and more importance afterwards before dissolving completely. It also explains why the really cruel and bad Emperor Phocas received his own column and other honoraries in the city. It was because he was a great benefactor of the papacy at Rome. Now in those days, the outerlying areas of Rome had been completely abandoned. Imagine a city that once housed 1 million people, now housing 20 times less that number. Hence, the outerlying areas would slowly degenerate into farmland. Collapsed buildings from earthquakes were just left lying on the outskirts, the building material reused for the construction of new buildings, mostly churches. Now, where did the population itself live? Well, it was found that they mostly lived in the area around the Campus Martius, then near the Forum Romanum and north of the Capitoline Hill near the Marcellus Theatre. So basically concentrated near the Tiber River, very much to the central parts of the city. And interestingly, the people still lived in the old insulae buildings. However, the upper floors had already become uninhabitable since the roof tiles were by that time already mostly no more, and thus the upper floor lay mostly bare. But the lower floors were still habitable, and that is where most of the population lived. Others had taken over the previous villas or domus of wealthy Romans who used to live there. Now, Constance's visit would have been all well and nice if something hadn't happened which would let this visit live on in infamy, beautifully visualized in this drawing by Lodovico Pogliagi. Paul the Deacon wrote in his History of the Lombards the following: "But the Emperor Constans, when he found that he could accomplish nothing against the Lombards, directed all the threats of his cruelty against his own followers, that is, the Romans. He left Naples and proceeded to Rome. At the 6th milestone from the city, Pope Vitalian came to meet him with his priests and the Roman people. And when the emperor had come to the threshold of St. Peter, he offered there a pallium woven with gold, and remaining at Rome 12 days, he pulled down everything that in ancient time had been made of metal for the ornament of the city, to such an extent that he even stripped off the roof of the Church of the Blessed Mary, which at one time was called the Pantheon, and had been founded in honor of all the gods, and was now by the consent of the former rulers the place of all the martyrs. And he took away from there the bronze tiles and sent them with all other ornaments to Constantinople." Now, how exactly this happened, we don't know, and this is the only source of this event that I know of. Paul the Deacon was a Lombard, and since Constans II was one of the very few Roman emperors from Constantinople who had waged war against the Lombards, probably killing quite a few of them, we can be pretty sure that Paul the Deacon was not very neutral on Constans II. In fact, we can be quite sure that he probably exaggerated Constans II's actions to make him appear much worse than he probably was. Now, it is true that Constans had campaigned against the Lombards with mediocre success, not being able to defeat them decisively. But then again, the empire was under attack from all sides, and so he couldn't spare too many men against the Lombards. What Constans actually tried to do was to reconquer Egypt and the Levant from the Muslims, and for that he desperately needed money. Thus, he had to raise the taxes, and he desperately needed to mint coins for the war preparations. That is why it might indeed have happened that he looted some buildings in Rome for their bronze ornaments. Of course, this created outrage, but let us not forget that many had done this before him. The Emperor Constantine had looted Rome already in 326 AD, carrying many statues and artworks off to Constantinople. Then the general Stilicho had removed the gold plating from the doors of the Temple of Jupiter in the early 400s. Then the Emperor Avitus had melted down statues in 456 in order to pay his Visigothic foederati and in order to pay for the war against the Vandals. So this wasn't really an uncommon practice, unfortunately. He probably did strip the roof of the Pantheon of its bronze tiles and probably stripped a few other bronze statues. But if it was him deliberately doing this, or if he had no choice because he had to pay his army, is hard to know. But likely Paul the Deacon's descriptions are exaggerated for the aforementioned reasons. It was planned to send the ship with the loot to Constantinople, but it was first sent to Syracuse, because it would be Syracuse from where the military operation against the Muslim Caliphate would have started. But after Constans II was famously murdered in the baths of Syracuse, the ship with the loot from Rome then fell into the hands of the Caliphate. A true tragedy. This whole episode when Constans II was in Rome, when Rome was still officially part of the Roman Empire, is absolutely fascinating. Some things remind us of the visits of the old emperors centuries earlier. But in other regards, Rome had changed. Yet still, the air of late antiquity somehow was still around in those 12 days when Constans II visited Rome in the year 663 AD. If you like this video, please consider supporting this channel via Patreon or via YouTube membership, because it is your support which makes this channel possible. You would have my utmost gratitude. And I would like to give a special shout out to our new Sol Invictus member KT. Thank you so much, KT, for your generous support of Maiorianus. I really cannot thank you enough. And of course, I want to thank everybody who's supporting Maiorianus. You people are amazing. And if you want to learn more about the 3 largest temples of Rome, you can watch this video in the upper right corner. But if you want to learn more about Rome after the fall, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.